Hello, everybody. Welcome to you all. Welcome to Japan circa 1972, setting the stage for Okinawan Reversion, the inaugural Gilbert and Margaret Nee Lecture in Asian Studies, hosted by the Humanities Division at UC Santa Cruz and the Okinawa Memories Initiative. I'm Alan Christie. I'm the director of the Okinawa Memories Initiative and an associate professor in the Department of History. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event today. This lecture series is made possible by by the Gilbert and Margaret Nee Fund in Asian Studies, an endowment that was created in 1971 to support the enrichment of teaching and research in Asian Studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. I would personally like to thank Gilbert and Margaret's son, Victor Nee, for his recent contribution to this fund and for his support of this event. Victor Nee graduated from UC Santa Cruz with a degree in history in 1967, making him a pioneer alumnus. He went on to secure his PhD from Harvard in sociology and is now the Frank and Rosa Rhodes Professor of Economic Sociology at Cornell University, Director of the Economic Sociology Lab, Director of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Thank you to the entire Nee family for your lasting impact on our campus. Before we get fully underway, I want to acknowledge that the land where University of California, Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Waswas-speaking Lupi tribe. Today, the Amamutsan tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to the missions of Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Land acknowledgement is important for recognizing the history of stolen lands and the presence of indigenous peoples and their enduring relationship to their traditional homelands. And we believe it is important that land acknowledgements aren't just a token gesture. I'd like to share a couple of details about this afternoon's event. We are using a webinar tool, so there's no chat function. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the presentations, and we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. You can access the closed captioning feature available on Zoom by clicking the CC box on your screen and selecting Show Subtitle. And you may access Japanese English translation services, so translation from English into Japanese for this event, by clicking the interpretation box on your screen and selecting your preferred language. And this event is being recorded. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Yoshikuni Igarashi. Professor Igarashi got his PhD in history at the University of Chicago in 1994. We were graduate students there together, so we've known each other for many years now. He has been teaching at Vanderbilt University, I believe, since that time, where he is now a full professor in the Department of History. He has published 3 books and numerous articles, but I'll highlight the books. His first book, Bodies of Memory, Narratives of War and Post-War Japanese Culture, 1945 to 1970, was published by Princeton University Press in 2000. I've used that book many times in classes up till now, and some of my best lectures, I have to say, are, well, I won't say stolen from Professor Igarashi, but I use his materials heavily, and I'm always glad to cite him to the students. In 2016, he came out with his second book, Homecomings, The Belated Return of Japan's Lost Soldiers, from Columbia University Press. And just this year in May, he came out with his third book, the book that will be the subject of our conversation tonight, Japan circa 1972, Masculinity in the Age of Mass Consumption and Metavisuality. So this is the inaugural event in a series of events that the Okinawa Memories Initiative intends to put on in the coming year, which will be the 50th anniversary of the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And with this inaugural event, I'm hoping that we can set the stage for thinking about the broader historical context of that reversion event. So I can think of nobody that I would rather have guide us into that world of 1972 than my good friend and incredibly valued scholar. Just everything that Professor Igarashi writes is something that I treasure so much. I can't think of anybody better than Professor Igarashi to guide us into that year. Professor Igarashi will give a presentation of about 20 minutes on the book itself, what he was hoping to achieve, what he'd like to alert future readers to. And then Drew Richardson, a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, will join him in a conversation, and we will take your questions at the end. And so without further ado, let me please hand it over to Professor Igarashi for his presentation.
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
All right, great. Thank you, Alan, for a wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me for this great opportunity, giving me the opportunity to talk about my work. Not only that, by connecting my work to the important question of Okinawan issues, forcing me to expand my intellectual horizon. So I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity and engage in conversation with you all today. So to get going, I'd like to share some slides. And this is to establish the basis for our conversation. I would like to provide enough, probably 15, 20 minutes of the discussion about what my book is about. And then we turn to next phase and the stage and engage in conversation with Drew, and then open up for the question and answers. So let me share the screen. I have PowerPoint. Okay. Just a minute. Started wrong place. All right, let me try again. All right, so this is a start. So I'd like to highlight 3 points or 3 threads of discussion about this book, from this book. And I'll be brief, and probably Drew will sort of follow up on any of the top points that I will leave unexplained. All right, so the first thing is that this book is about mass consumer society, the rise of mass consumer society in Japanese society, in Japan. And I put 1972 as a turning point or tipping point in the transition into the mass consumer society. The second point is television and associated visual media were important aspect of this transformation. So whole experience was by and large visual. And once again, I'll explain this a little later. And the third point, this book is about the crisis of Japanese manhood. So the transformation into the mass consumer society meant a radical change. Japanese society experienced the tumultuous time period, radical changes in society. And the responses from the society was varied. And some of the responses are anxiety-induced. Some of them are even violent. And what I'm talking about in this book is the book focuses on the cultural response, especially popular cultural response, the ways in which popular culture responded to this time of crisis. So let me get into the details here. So mass consumer society, I'm not going to discuss this concept in details. I think it's just enough to say the mass consumer society is a space where consumption becomes the important asset, important means for individuals to establish themselves in society. And the change, once again, was gradual and cumulative. But in 1972, those changes finally got to the point that changed the nature of Japanese society. And if this adage, if you have what you buy, if this makes sense to you, you are living in mass consumer society. And that's enough for now. And I prepared 2 sets of images to explain the process of this transformation. The first set is this, basically taking the shape of Japanese national flag. And imagine that the square part or the area within the rectangular shape is Japan's legal territories. And the circle in the middle is representing the regime of modernization, basically the power to be. In the leftist term, this is the system that produced the whatever benefits, industrial economic benefit to the people. And hypothetically, legally, people within this rectangular shape are treated equal. But in this case, like any other cases, some people are more equal. So people closer to the center appreciated or they had access to the benefits produced by the regime of modernization. If you stand outside of this circle, for example, if you are blue-collar workers or tenant farmers, you were standing outside. Let me change the pen. You are standing outside. And then you are not there yet. You are not included in this regime yet. However, as you see, this circle is smudged. And this signifies that circle was fast growing, starting 1950s, kept growing and growing, and eventually looks like this. So although you used to stand outside here, eventually this regime expanded enough to include you. And in specific terms, you are included, you became insider just because you are able to purchase mass-produced products such as television, such as a refrigerator, such as washing machines. The fact that you are able to purchase those items qualify you as an inside member. So that's what happened here. And also this made the task of the leftists, critical thinking, very difficult. It used to be very easy. Going back here. In old system, the leftist discourse, leftist critical thinking is identify with the outside position from which to critique the system or regime. And those were, as I said, could be the blue-collar workers or tenant farmers. There are abundant places outside. But as the high growth economy expanded and the benefit reached the majority of people, then imagining outside the system became extremely difficult. And hence the challenge of critical thinking. And I will come back to this point briefly at the end. Another set of slides is to show the process of transformation here. So it takes both production and consumption to produce a mass consumer society. It's quite obvious. And you need to have products, right, to sell. And but what happened here is a slight change, gradual slight change on the side of consumption. Media images, advertisement, disposable income, those things grew to the point that it tipped the balance. Once this balance tipped to this side, the side of consumption, by the way, TV and media was added weight on this balance. And once this balance shifted, then there was no coming back, no going back to the old system. And then Japanese society was qualified as mass consumer society. All right, so television. The basic claim, the fundamental claim I make about the television is that television is not a transparent medium. We tend to think that the television is a transparent medium through which information is delivered to individuals. But my hyperbolic claim is that television is works both ways, interactive media. And I can give you one example from Miyamoto Tsuneichi's note. And by the way, Alan Christie writes about Miyamoto's scholarship in his book. This is from 1960s when he was teaching at Kanagawa University. And this is before summer break. And he gave his students a summer assignment. He asked students to write about what they learned during the summer. Very simple, very short essay. an assignment. So students wrote, and 10 of them wrote about the housing conditions in the countryside. And 3 of them wrote and insisted that farmers were renovating their houses because of television. Now, I need to explain this connection here a little bit. Their thinking is this, farmers' thinking is this. They felt somehow city folks are peeping into their space, because what they saw on the screen is beautiful city space, urban areas. Television is showing that the cities, urban space is a better place, beautiful place. And contrast, whenever they see their environment, meaning that the rural area, rural environment, they are regarded as dirty, backward, even feudal. So farmers internalized television gaze and began to see their own space as feudal, dirty, backward. And then therefore they felt they have to renovate their own house. So that is one of the few examples I talk about in this book, but I try to show that television is very emotional machine and engages people who watch on the screen. All right. So that's the image. So here is Minamoto. Finally, I present this study as the study of Japanese manhood, or the crisis of Japanese manhood. What I mean by this is the crisis was, well, let me back up a little bit. The rise or the presence of mass consumer society was seen as a moment of crisis. And this is a new social conditions that appeared in Japan. And people did not have the language framework through which to understand what's happening in Japanese society. So some of them, or perhaps many of them, went back to the old paradigm, gender paradigm, and in which as consumption is associated with feminine, production is associated with masculine. And when the consumer society takes over Japanese society, it was a crisis of masculinity in Japanese society. So popular culture, when you take a look at the popular culture, and this is a time period, late 1960s, 1970s, they tried to produce the heroic figures, men fighting for their independence, men fighting the social conditions. But what's interesting is in the popular culture, often those heroes fall short in their endeavor. That I find it interesting, that I find valuable. So the book is about the appreciation of what they produce, appreciation of those struggles portrayed in popular culture with the conditions arising in mass consumer society. And finally, I had to talk about the why 1972 as opposed to 1968. So much is talked about 1968. And what I find problematic 1968 is that 1968 is the story, the drama about men, heroic men fighting against this deleterious influence, deleterious power of consumer society or the changes in society. And also in the cultural discussion as well, and the man of genius, the cutting edge people, avant-garde people, challenging, and thanks to their genius, they are able to transcend and stand above what's happening in Japanese society. And that's 1968 view, in my opinion. And by shifting the focus a little later to the moment that mass consumer society takes over Japan, by and large, we can see how the people grappled with these effects rather than these heroic battles. We can see how people struggled on the ground and how popular culture tried to scoop up those images and try to produce the narrative, dramas that would appeal to the masses. So by shifting the focus by several years, I think we can talk about different kind of Japan. So that's the gist of my argument. All right, so I stop here, and I'd like to invite Drew for the conversation.
Great, thank you very much. That was actually a really wonderful presentation. What I wanted to do before starting more in-depth questions is do a bit of a warm-up with some biographical questions. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the genesis of the book project. How did you become interested in television and consumption?
Besides the fact that I wasted so much time watching television when I was a kid, I felt like I had to somehow recover my investment. But that's personal stuff. But the encountering, reading that Miyamoto's account is one. I was not expecting that kind of. No, I sort of suspected television is something was not transparent. I suspected it, but Miyamoto's account supported my suspicion. And also another impetus is the first book. The first book, Body's Memory. I closed that book with the discussion of Mishima's protest. Mishima, of course, killed himself in protest against what's going on in Japanese society in late 1960s, 1970s. My argument was, yes, he did so, but white noise produced by Japanese media and society overdrowned his voice, and his protest was ineffective. As a matter of fact, it became a symbol consumed by Japanese media. So I just wanted to go back there and explain what I meant by white noise, as far as how this white noise came to fill Japanese society.
I see. So thinking then of Bodies of Memory, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between your three books? So between the recent book, Bodies of Memory, and Homecomings, how are they related to each other?
I didn't know when I started this project 20-some years ago, but now I can see them as a trilogy. I started the Body's Memory. Basically, the book talks about the war memories and popular culture. And the Homecomings is the book that also talks about war memories, but emphasis shifts a little bit to media. And in this final corner of triangle, the Japan 1972, I shifted focus on media and popular culture. But all three books talk about three elements: war memories, media, as far as popular culture in different degrees. So it's different sort of a weight placed on these elements. So they're all connected.
Could you talk a bit more about the kinds of sources that you used for Japan 1972? You mentioned the different kinds of media. Reading it, one of the things I was struck by is how diverse they are, from manga to film to travel campaigns.
This is where I had to be creative, because I was expecting that somebody sort of had done the digging, and the archives or the materials are there in abundance, especially television, because television was new. And there were a lot of print media already when television was first introduced, but that was not the case. I guess nobody really took television seriously. So what I wanted to see, for example, how people responded for first time television was introduced, that kind of things were never or hardly ever recorded. So what I encountered was a lot of platitude about how television shocked and also what welcomed by people. But I could not go beyond that. So I had to be creative in terms of searching the traces of television, and also finding what kind of encounters happened. So by nature, the sources, especially first two chapters, the sources I use are fragmentary, and I'm trying to put them together and trying to come up with larger narrative. And I had an easier time in the later chapters when I talk about actual cultural productions of mass culture, but still, these things are not treated very seriously. People don't, especially academics, somehow they have, I don't know, high, sort of a disdaining attitude about popular culture. And because of that, I had a sort of a difficulty connecting what's the popular media produced and what the critical discourse about culture, the kind of tool they offer, the connecting them was a sort of challenge in this project.
I see. So then in your search for sort of these fragments of commentary about television, did the research take you anywhere unexpected? Was there any detour that surprised you?
I wanted to be surprised. I wanted to find that, oh my God, how could anybody miss it? No, that surprise was, there was no surprise. And this is sort of goes back to my scholarship. If I may explain my scholarship as a style, I don't go far out looking for sort of archival research and trying to find the stuff that nobody else ever touched. What I deal with is often the stuff people have already looked at, read many times. My belief is that the most important things or most interesting things are hidden in plain sight. So I'm constantly going back to the things that, perhaps people talked about a million times. And I'm going there once the first time and trying to provide different ways of looking at these familiar sources.
I see. So I wanted to ask you then again about the dates. You explained a bit about why you chose 1972 and how you see it as a shift from 1968. One of the things I liked about the book is the discussion of Yakuza Film and the way that you trace a sort of evolution from 68 to 72. Would you care to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So we can date that the day Yakuza film died as a genre, on March 6, 1972. This is when the Kanto Hizakura Ikka as a film, the famous film, was released to the audience. And this is the first happy ending Yakuza film, because this is the film to commemorate the retirement of Fuji Junko, the star of the Yakuza film. And with that, basically, Yakuza film as a genre died. So overpopulation and fan getting used to getting tired of the pattern that repeated on the screen. And all of a sudden, this film announced that that's it, no more. So there were efforts made afterwards, and especially the films made by Fukasaku Kinji, Jingyaki Tatakai series, that extended the life of the Yakuza film, but it did not radically change the nature of the Yakuza film. So I still think 1972 is the end point of Yakuza film. So added to that is that I traced the changes of many things. And I found 1972 is a point where those vectors, many vectors, tended to crisscross. And yes, some crisscrossing happened before and after, but majority of them seems to meet in 1972. And that's why one reason that I emphasize 1972 is a turning point in Japanese history. And if I may add a little more, so this is a process. Also, I'm putting this in the long process. The process of the production of mass consumer society began in 1920s in Japan, urban area, metropolitan areas. And their circle was very tiny. Then it gradually expanded in 1970s, as we saw in the shape of television. And that was not the end of it. It still continued on. As we live in mass consumer society, and what we have is quite different from 1972, but still that 1972 was a turning point in terms of that encompassing mass consumer society, encompassing Japan as such.
And this is shifting away from that topic, but can you talk a bit about the context of the argument? So the kinds of discussions or debates that the book is intervening in or engaging in. So in what ways, for example, is television useful for understanding the consciousness of the middle class, or Churyu Ishiki?
Okay, the Churyu Ishiki is not middle class. And also, I would argue that the product of media as well. In a way, this is part of the, it's not economic class, but the consciousness created because of the economic change as well as the media development. So in a way, I'm just putting television in the center and front of this discussion of the mass consumer society, as well as transformation in Japanese society in this time period. As I said, if we think television is just a transparent medium, then there's no way to talk about it. But if we can register the kind of things that television did, then perhaps that will add layer to our conversation of our understanding of our post-war society. And also, now going back to the point I was making, that I was sort of frustrated. So much emphasis is on, when we talk about 1968, so much emphasis is on cutting edge experimental works of art. I mean, they are interesting to a degree, but if we exclusively focus on these arts, experimental arts, then we're turning away from larger popular culture, which were not as cutting edge, not as exciting perhaps, but that's, was the arena that majority people appreciated, enjoyed the product of popular culture.
I see. So speaking of arenas, in Bodies of Memory, you have a chapter on Rikidozan and
Yes.
television in public. And it seems to me that if Bodies of Memory is about television in a public space, or at least a chapter of it is, Japan 1972 is about television in the domestic space.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about how the meaning or the way in which television operates shifts from external to internal?
Well, I think the contrast is analogous to the contrast between films and television. Film as the medium or the image shared in the public space. So initially television was introduced in such a way, but that was only short-lived. And the television recovered sort of the original, or the, the function of being in the private space and intrusively. This is part of the problem, right? The television smoothly entered into private space and nobody really took the notice. And that's precisely what made it difficult to talk about this transition. So I think that transition happened very early in the introduction of television. And I think the leap was bigger from, leap from the film to television was bigger than the public viewing of television to the private viewing of television.
And once then television moved inside the home, how does it operate differently as a media? You quote Marshall McLuhan's infamous "The Media is the Message" early on in one of the chapters. And it's interesting because I think the argument is that television is an interactive media, or with a circular vision,
Right.
which is something that maybe McLuhan would agree with. At least that was the kinds of arguments that he was making about television as compared to film, which is something that is just sort of passively absorbed. How do you think of television as a medium in the domestic space?
Yeah, I like to think that I'm extending his argument, and his statement here is right on the target. We cannot distinguish contents from the form, contents from the ways in which this media works. So I think up to this point, so many studies have focused on the contents, what's shown on the television screen, but I am trying to balance it with the idea that yes, the way the contents are shown, the way people are watching them did matter. And so perhaps I'm putting the emphasis on the form too much in this book. Perhaps the balance should be hit. We need to strike balance perhaps, but at least I have the task of emphasizing the form part in this book.
I see. Actually, I must admit, I'm always happy to see a McLuhan reference, maybe just because I'm Canadian or I'm a McLuhan fan, but
I'm happy to help help you. Yes.
Um, Another thing you discuss is Sato Eisaku's retirement announcement in 1972 and how he wanted to speak directly to the people of Japan in their homes through television. And he effectively pushed newspaper reporters out of the room. The idea was that television was supposedly the medium that shows things how they are.
Mhm.
Can you explain a bit about how the medium of television was different from newspapers at the time, or at least how it was understood to be different in this respect?
I have a few things to tell you about the television at that point. So I was looking for the footage of the ceremony of Okinawan Reversion, and there was a short NHK footage, a news footage on internet, which does very interesting thing. Basically juxtaposes Sato crying over reversion, and the Okinawan governor. So juxtapose that Sato crying, and juxtaposed with that is the image of Okinawan governor critiquing how insufficient this reversion is as a practice. And so this is NHK doing this, basically sending the message that, it's a critical message toward, critical message against what happened in terms of Okinawan reversion. So Sato was mistaken. It's not transparent at all. And there's always producer sending messages. And perhaps I can sort of answer that question a little bit differently. Difference between media, the television and the newspaper as medias. For example, the time they spent on either media is quite different. By this time, meaning that by mid-1960s, Japanese people at average were spending 1,000 hours a year, which is about more than 3 hours a day watching television. Whereas, probably 20, 30 minutes at max reading newspaper. So quantitatively, different kind of relationship was established between the two, between people, the audience, and these two medium. And one interesting episode is that the August 1972 newspaper finally admitted newspapers were defeated by television. What I mean by that is that in the newspaper, today you pick up the Japanese newspaper, and then the television information is on the backside, right? And you pick up the newspaper to check the television program. And that was not the case till early 1970s. And Asahi was the last newspaper that moved the newspaper television information that used to be buried inside to the backside, so that people can use newspaper for information paper for TV programs. And that also happened in 1972. So I would claim the relationship between the two changed in the early 1970s.
And then what about the weeklies or the weekly magazines that would complicate the mix as well? You talk about them in the book.
Yeah, weekly magazines, once again, it's a new media, and it's interestingly almost simultaneously introduced into the market. So I see the codependency between the two, weeklies and magazines. And weekly magazines are filling the kind of things that television cannot cover. At the same time, showing the inside and backstories. And so they're fulfilling different functions at the same time, working together to create more intimate space within the family space. And I think the good example is the wedding of the royal couple, Akihito. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I see. So to return to the question of media, what do you think then about live television as being a specific kind of media? I'm thinking of your discussion of the Osama Sanso incident here in particular, where there's a very different audience response to the live broadcast as to the details that emerge later.
Um, I think live TV had more power effect in terms of engaging viewers. First, there's an interesting episode when they first airing the programs in the public spaces. TV announcers would call out and tell people that so-and-so, at what location, please don't climb on the tree because it's dangerous, as if he can see what's happening on the other side of the screen. So that kind of interactions happen early on. And that indicates that live TV, live sort of interactions can create stronger ties with audience. And Asama Sanso Jiken is perhaps an exception in many ways. 64 million people watched at the height of this conflict in February 1972. And to imagine making connection with 64 million people is just unfathomable. So in terms of scale, in terms of impact, it's a totally different game from this idyllic days of an introduction when the television was first introduced. So it's different kind of interactions, but still the direct contact, the live television had that kind of power over viewers.
Could I ask you to talk a little bit about the Osama Sanso incident to explain to our viewers who don't know what that is? And
sure, briefly.
Oh, yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
So this is the United Red Army, the new leftist group. They created the training camps in the mountains of central Japan. And when they are surrounded police and they try to escape the police detection, they decided accidentally, I guess, took the route toward the Karuizawa, where the place is known for the resort town as a resort town. And that's where they seized one of the cabins, not the cabins, but the Sanso, and took the hostage and stayed there 9 days. At the end of 9 days, the police made advance and finally captured them alive. And this whole process in the final day was televised. And the TV announcer was commenting on this strange situation that now we are sending this strange image to, the whole situation is strange because we are sending the whole image, whole event to this safe space of living room. And yes, that's the sort of the gist of the event. This whole event was televised to the nation, and nation consumed this supposedly new left battle against police.
This might be a good time to start talking about violence, or your discussion of violence in the book, now that we're talking about that incident. Can you connect the ideas of masculinity and violence that you introduce in the text, and how violence figures into your argument?
So the violence, to talk about violence, I think we need to talk about the body. Basically, the mass consumer society was felt as constrained in one way. One way of, the individuals felt this constraint was constraints on their body, the ways in which they are. This is where one has to become Foucauldian, but basically your life, your activities, surroundings are controlled. Think about the clothes you wear, the things you come in contact, everything around you is controlled, produced, mass produced. And so the body itself becomes the subject of control. And so the violence is, especially male violence, was a way, it's conceived as a way to break out of these constraints, rip it all together and show true self. And that's a sort of a basic tenor of mass culture. And in various ways, this the violence was seen as one way to lead to the hypothetical outside of mass consumer society.
I have another question for you about masculinity, or crises of masculinity. You mention a few times in the text the danshi or multi-unit apartment complexes
Mhm.
that had become popular. How do changes in living accommodations to people living in these danshis relate to appliances and the new mass culture?
Well, I see that as the sort of a pinnacle of the modern space. Modern space is realized in the danchi, these concrete boxes. And many people saw them. Yes, they were small. They are sort of tiny, walk-up building, they walk-up apartments, but they still thought this was the cutting edge, sort of the essence of modern life. So, interestingly, these danchi had a space designated for appliances, as if they come together as a set. And that's a part of the sort of a constraint and surrounding of individual bodies as well. Yes, that's comfortable. Yes, that sort of embodies the modernity in your living space. But flip side of that is basically you are encaged. So the appliances become extension of this encagement, a cage, and enabling the comfort. Comfort becomes the sort of a curse word in this case. And also anxiety producing space. The concrete walls, they're separating, creating private spaces, but nobody knows what really goes on in private space. And that sort of encouraged, or they created anxious responses to this modern space. So it was not all beautiful. Yes, superficially on surface, it was beautiful space, but that space was also anxiety ridden.
I see. It's funny, your discussion really reminds me of the short story by Yamakawa Masao in 1964 called Omamori or the Talisman. I'm not sure if you've read that, but a man returns home to a danchi and enters his apartment and sees another man talking to his wife and is immediately very concerned. And then he realizes that it's not actually his wife and it's not his apartment either. It's just so identical with the appliances and the layout that he becomes confused, and this kind of anxiety haunts him. And in order to protect his identity, he starts carrying around a stick of dynamite in his briefcase. And he continues to do so until he reads in the newspaper that there's been a sudden explosion and this other man that he met before has died. And he puts two and two together and realizes that the other man too must have been carrying dynamite. So even that particular sort of violent symbol of individuality is not unique at all.
Unique, no, and copied. And so that kind of rhetoric, that kind of image is sort of a stock image in Japanese comedy. So often men drunk, sort of burning into another person's apartment, not without realizing this is a separate set. Yes. And it sounds like this story is taking that to extreme.
Yeah, I wanted to ask too, do you see anywhere else this sort of fear or anxiety of living an identical life related to mass consumption and appliances and television? You mentioned a little bit in the book about the Discover Japan campaign and the way in which it markets itself to young women, and how often on their travels they sort of might realize that their journeys are not unique at all, and their dress is not unique at all.
They're carrying the same magazines and they're taking the same footsteps. Yes, till that moment, till they realize that they are in their own. And also Discover campaign is conceived as basically setting up the stage for these travelers so that they can be the one acting. At the same time, they are the ones consumed in this campaign. So that's interesting. I think it's sort of a resonate idea of television as the interactive media. In the same way, Discover Japan campaign was interactive. Yes, they are selling the idea, but they're also encouraging people to act as actors in this particular setting.
Before we move on to some more Okinawa-centric questions, perhaps you could talk about a bit about the Discover Japan campaign and the way that it's gendered. Your book talks also about manga and the way in which the sort of solitary male traveler goes to the countryside for a certain kind of experience. How are those different gendered reactions to the consumer society different?
So I talk about Tsuge Yoshiharu, the Japanese manga artist, and the pieces from this period, the covers, or they take the theme on the protagonist going different locations, and basically inserting himself into the scenery and claiming ownership, often in violent way, or if not violent, sexual way. So what's happening here is old traditional sort of a nostalgic Japan is gender as female. A male protagonist goes there, take advantage of that, or create a union with that scenery. And that becomes the ideal interaction between the protagonist and the scenery or Japan. So that was successful in 1960s. In his work in 1960s, that still can happen. But turn the page, early 1970s, he begins to change the tones, and he becomes more self-reflective in that it became impossible. And he knows that, and that becomes part of the story, that he knows, the protagonist knows that he's trying to take advantage of this Discover campaign or the nostalgic vision of Japan. He tries to go there, take advantage of it, but he can't, and he knows that. So that change happened quickly over 5 years between 68 and 73. And that once again, as another trajectory I follow, and that crisscross with 1972.
I see. Well, thank you very much. So I'd like to shift our discussion at this point to Okinawa, as we're here partially to talk about reversion. I understand that this is moving beyond the scope of your book, so you're overwhelmingly generous in accommodating us here. What I'd like to know first is a bit more about the relationship between television consumerism and the national community. In an earlier image, you demonstrated the expansion of the regime of the high growth economy. I'm wondering what kinds of places would have been outside of, or at least at the outer edges of this regime. Of course, I have Okinawa in mind, but I'm wondering how you would place it.
So geographical outside used to be closer to the center, but the outside is pushed the edge. So by the late 1960s, really extreme edges. And then eventually that edge reaches to Okinawa. And so yes, 1960s, in a way, Japanese media discovered Okinawa as an outside where counter identities, counter discourse, counter, everything is reserved. So they try to capture Okinawa as something different. And this is the Hanada Toshinori, but he has a book called Okinawa wa Gojiraka. And he complains that it's not 1960s per se, but often media, Japanese media treat Okinawa like Godzilla, meaning that the Godzilla coming from the deep sea, bottom of the deep sea, and carries the resentment, the war memories, and everything that destructive, is Okinawa has become Godzilla in media's view. So that shows that kind of discussion support my view that Okinawa was discovered as a powerful outside the Japanese, this space that's now nationalized, and enjoying the moment of mass consumer society. And yeah, so.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I stop here.
Oh, I was just going to say, can we talk a bit more about the forces that place Okinawa at the outside? Is it the occupation? You mentioned geographical distance. I mean, obviously there's no rail to Okinawa, so it can't participate in the Discover Japan campaign, but also things like an uneven distribution of economic growth or a late arrival of television.
Right, and also, and of course, the presence of bases and American
Yes.
presence, which is concentrated in Okinawa. in a way, Okinawa is exceptionalized in many ways. But at the same time, Okinawa, it was included as the same space. As long as Okinawan can consume, as long as Okinawans can buy stuff, they are admitted into the same space. So they are in a very peculiar space, I think, even within the mass consumer society. So the problem is this. In a way, what disappeared is the leftist discourse of the outside. So outside stopped to be the effective leftist counter concept. And Okinawa remains to be outside within Japan. So it cannot be rendered through the language of leftist effectively. We have to devise new way of understanding Okinawa's stance, relationship with Japan. It's not just simple outside, it's something different, but we don't have the framework. We don't have the language because we've been so, in quotes, so deeply mired in leftist counter argument, counter identity. So we have to somehow separate, think differently. That's what we are required of at this moment.
I see. And when you mentioned the bases, and of course I'm thinking about television still, do you know if television paid as much attention as local papers to base problems, things like criminal acts, traffic collisions, military accidents? In the book, you do mention the radioactive coolant leaks at Sasebo being a major television incident prior to the Osama Sanso Jiken.
Yes, what's happening in Okinawa, especially in 1960s, the television was very critical, for example, of the Vietnam War, the war America engaged in Vietnam. So extension of that, in relation to that, Okinawa was covered, what's happening in Okinawa was covered. But that's still, I don't know, Okinawa was, I don't feel Okinawa was center of that. What center was American actions in Vietnam, and Okinawa happened to be in its way. That's the sense I have. Of course, I stand to be corrected, and that this is an area I'd like to look into more.
I have more of a comment here than a question, but if you'll bear with me. In my own research, I came across a draft address for the opening of the Okinawa Hoso Kyokai transmitter on December 21st of 1968. And the address was meant to be delivered by Joseph S. Evans of USCAR Public Affairs in place of the High Commissioner at the time. And I think pretty accurately portrays an idea about television that USCAR shares. So in the address, he says, every culture has had myths of some enchanted device, a mirror, a crystal ball, a bowl of water, in which one could see events taking place far off. We now have this magic device, and instead of using it to its great potential, we are inclined to take it for granted. This new television complex is significant in that it has potential for significant contribution. It can contribute by helping to raise to its due prominence the native Ryukyuan culture, some facets of which face oblivion. Imagine its contribution to education in all its phases. Think of what it can do in promoting worthwhile advances in all fields, economic, social, and cultural. Think of its influence in unifying all the people of all the islands, its power for civic betterment, and its assistance in establishing good community relations. I mean, this is obviously an extremely optimistic take by USCAR, but it reminds me so much of the model of television for education that you discuss in Dawn Over the Mountains. Do you think that maybe Okinawa is comparable to rural Tochigi then in this case?
Probably not. Okinawa's case is that the language strikes me more like a language pacification. The television will be useful for, I don't know, appeasing Okinawan people. That's the kind of, I don't know, colonial mentality I sort of detect in that language. So in the 1959 case I talk about in the Tochigi example is the more of the pure belief that television can really help out. The television is the technology of the future. But by 1968, everybody knows television was mired in a political contest. Who controlled the media? controls the content. So the official must have known that the television was not and does not exist in vacuum. Whereas 1959, television was still in the early age, and there's a lot of optimism. Also, in Japanese early television was sold. The television was characterized as the media for education. Now, for various reasons, the Japanese television stations were obliged to provide educational programs. So the association between education and television was there at the very beginning, and that lasted a long time. But I don't think that was the case in 1968 in Okinawa. So when the official talks about education, it's really a pacification.
I think appeasement also, as you said, makes a lot of sense as well. One of the other sets of documents I found are all of these guides published by USCAR showing how Okinawans how to fix their television sets because they were upset that, obviously upset, right? That this expensive device isn't working because of the interference caused by radio towers.
Powerful radio signals, yeah.
Yes. I want to ask another question about chapter 3 in the book, because it sets up another potential comparison between Okinawa and actually Hokkaido in this case. So in chapter 3, you discuss Yamada Yoji's films with particular attention to his 1970 film Kazoku, or in English, When Spring Comes Late, which follows the railway journey of a family from Iojima, Nagasaki to Nakashibetsu, Hokkaido. The family is in search of a new life, fleeing the encroaching changes of the high-growth economy, and Hokkaido is imagined to be a safe haven of wide open spaces. I'm wondering if you can contrast for us the place of Hokkaido and Okinawa in the popular imagination of the time. Did Okinawa too exist outside the purview of the high-growth economy and offer potential relief, like Hokkaido in the film, or was it a place to flee from, like Iojima? You also mentioned that many coal miners ended up leaving for South America, especially Bolivia, which I mean is also true for a lot of Okinawans.
Right. So you're asking many questions here.
I'm sorry, that was long.
No, let me try to sort of answer one at a time. So the coal mining used to be the mainstay of Japanese economy, but this fell a victim of Japan's new energy policy. So by 1960, it was a declining industry. So workers, laborers in coal mines have to find new jobs. But once again, this is a masculine identity associated with coal miners. So they were at the cutting edge of Kyushu, the leftist organizations. They organized themselves, they fought against the capitals and the government, and Kyushu was the hotbed of the counter politics. But that too fell, and then silence, and then workers have to find new places. So that's sort of in the background of the film, in 1970 film. So interestingly, the protagonist decide to go, instead of working in nearby town, decide to go to Hokkaido, from Kyushu to Hokkaido, and he crosses the entire length of Japan and experiences tragedy, experiences the Japan and the high growth economy. So Hokkaido was regarded, it's still expensive place to go, and regarded as somehow outside of normal range, outside, still it's kind of outside. And case in point is the Yakuza film, Abashiri prison, which is not too far away from the location the family arrive in the film, is regarded as the most fierce, most difficult place to be imprisoned for Japanese the criminals. So that big association is still here, still with the Japanese media. So Hokkaido and Abashiri, so signals outside of the system. So the film, if the film was shot in 1972, probably this film should start from Okinawa, and that will complete, from outside to outside. But this is 1970 film, and in terms of budget, they had to start from the far south as possible, probably therefore Kyushu to Hokkaido. But I see this film as more like from Okinawa to Hokkaido, from two extremes to an extreme to an extreme.
I see. Shifting gears to another potential kind of escape, you also discuss Kaiko Takeshi's work on the Vietnam War and how the war experience was a potential escape from the high growth era. You quote him saying that a hopeless situation filled with absolute energy describes his impressions there. I'm wondering if the experience of the occupation of the ongoing Vietnam War might have set up a similar attraction for some mainland Japanese, or connects to the war tourism that exists today in Okinawa?
As far as I'm aware of, there was no war tourism. And in back 1960s or even 1970s, it was very difficult to get access to images of what's happening in the Vietnam, the American bases. They are very jealously guarded. They didn't want to show what's happening in the bases. So probably not. Okinawa was more like, once again, where Japanese rules do not apply. For example, before reversion, that's where they can buy liquors cheap because custom, they're duty-free stuff. So that's the kind of stuff they travel there, bring omiyage, and then have nightlife, I guess, and the clubs and whatnot. So perhaps this is the the tours the man made to Korea, Southeast Asia. Okinawa was another example of that as well.
I see. So I'm looking at the time now, and we have 15 minutes for questions. So we should probably start answering questions.
Yes.
I'm sorry to cut off our discussion.
Okay, so.
Okay,
Would you like to read?
sure. So the first question that came in was thinking about connection to Okinawa in 1972 and your notion of this expanding circle. What can be said about how travel and tourism may play into mass consumption, especially considering the efforts made during the 60s to present Okinawa as a space of escape for mainland Japanese?
I think there was a little time delay. I'm not sure if I'm addressing this correctly.
We sort of addressed that, yes.
Yeah, but 1975, there was Kaiohaku, right? Oceanic the Expo. So as soon as Japan, the Okinawa was reverted back to Japan, then yes, mainland capital tried to take advantage of Okinawa's location. And what's interesting or distressing was basically the money earned Okinawa was siphoned back into Japanese capital, a mainland capital. So that cycle was reestablished. So yes, travel it became important aspect of selling Okinawa, but who's benefited? Mainland capital, perhaps.
The next question asks you to talk a little bit more about the conditions of Okinawa and how those might figure into the book's argument for medium. So maybe the conditions of Okinawa and thinking about media.
Yeah, Okinawa has had its own sort of strong voices represented by Okinawan media. So Okinawan media is known for its independent coverage, independent streak. So I guess it's always in tension. It's sort of for example, NHK has the national network, and at the same time, Okinawa voices are somewhat represented through NHK, the channels as well. So I'm not sure if I can say much about Okinawa media because I don't know much about it. But my suspicion is that Okinawa's situation is somewhat different because it joined the national space of Japanese media a little later and under different conditions. So I would suspect the differences, but I can't not articulate the difference what there has been between the two.
Our next questioner identifies themselves as Travis Safeman, postdoc at Todai. He writes, by all means, I think you're of course right about this expansion of the regime of modernity, expansion of mass commercialism, etc., these post-war decades. But I'm wondering, by 1968, it's a full century since the Meiji Restoration. What about the expansion of modernity and commercialism and so forth over the course of that 1868 to 1968 century? Was it incomplete or different in character?
Good questions. Thank you for the question. The big question. So if I answer this in a short time, if I had 2 hours, probably I can get into details, but now in 3 minutes, perhaps we can make distinctions between early development and the development that happened under the high growth economy. And the earlier development was, basically industrialization, right? The nation leading the industry, leading the business, produce the infrastructure. And their individuals are there to serve, provide the services, the labor and taxes, most importantly, taxes. So that's led by nation. Whereas in post-war period, yes, efforts were led by nation, but eventually that circle became big enough to include, or the benefits were extended big enough to extend to the people who are just, they're people who used to be outside. They just used to pay taxes and being exploited for the citizens in service of the bigger center circle. But now they get to enjoy the fruit of their own labor. And that's rewarding, I think. That's the exciting time period. And that's completely different from the kind of relationship they had with industry. And in olden days, even in 1930s, the workers prided themselves, take the pride in the fact that they're independent. They're not really domesticated by the industry. They are free to move from one place to another. That's their pride, but that changed. And in the post-war period, it became more desirable. Even the workers, blue-collar workers, it became desirable to pursue a lifetime, long-term employment, become part of the member of industry. So something radically changed. That part of the change is this consumption-oriented society.
I see, thank you. So our next question is, I'm intrigued by the Okinawa as Godzilla comparison, especially considering that Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, starring King Shisa, is released in 1974, 2 years after Reversion.
Right.
In that movie, King Shisa, and by extension Okinawa, is very much brought into the fold and integrated into the new Japanese mythology of Godzilla. Does this track for your ideas of how the rise of mass media consumption subsumes the outside?
Yes, I was thinking about that example as well. Too bad it was not 1972. But yes, the Godzilla franchise goes over to different locations throughout Japan and destroyed the key landmark towers and buildings, and finally arrived in Okinawa as a gesture that Okinawa is finally worthy of this attention of franchise, as well as worthy of attention of Godzilla, this mythical creature. So yes, my answer is definitely yes to your comment.
If I could add to that, that's my favorite Godzilla film. There's a scene when, the Mechagodzilla from space is defeated because Godzilla puts him in a headlock, and then King Shisa comes up and attacks his stomach with his Shisa claws. So there's kind of an alliance between, the Godzilla of Japan and the King Shisa of Okinawa to take out this foreign threat, which is,
this is very precious. Yes. So yes, it's very political film in many ways. Yes.
That is all the questions that I see before me right now. Does anyone else want to ask a question? We have a few more minutes. So maybe while we wait for further questions, I can ask another of my own.
Yes, please.
In the conclusion, you mentioned Komatsu Sakyo's Nihon Chinbotsu, or Japan Sinks, and the author's desire to recreate a catastrophe for those Japanese who have easily forgotten the war. this seems to me to be something distinct from Okinawa, or at least not possible in Okinawa. I suspect most Okinawans didn't have the privilege of forgetting the war. I'm wondering, do you think that there's a connection here between seeking an outside in Okinawa? Or is it not necessary to imagine disaster in Okinawa because it has suffered the continual presence of the bases?
See, this is the important point at which you have to think about Okinawan experiences. So Komatsu's experience was, of course, limited to mainland experience, where the disaster happened. At the same time, main infrastructure remained. Japan was still functioning. So in a way, Komatsu's wish is just to wish. And whereas to the Okinawans, this is inconceivable, unthinkable. So different experiences perhaps led to different kind of imaginations. Yeah, it's Komatsu's case is very much wishful thinking that this is ultimate way to create the outside, right? Japan is destroyed, completely destroyed, and then only the outside remains. And yes, it was an exciting time period in post-war period. Japan is reconstructing out of nothing, but it was actually not nothing. Japan has some remnants of Japan, so Japan was able to build. Whereas Okinawa, the situation was completely different. It's leveled, and it's the Americans who came in to help to reconstruct Okinawa. So thank you for pointing that out.
Oh, thank you. We still don't have any other questions, so I'd encourage anyone that has any curiosity to submit something. But I have one last question for you that I haven't yet asked. And it's about Okinawa and travel, but I wanted to ask you, in the book, you discussed the Discover Japan campaign, and as you said, the manga of Suge Yoshihara, where travel to rural areas seems to offer the possibility of escape. Do you think that Okinawan tourism has been framed similarly? If so, do you think or see Okinawa tourism being gendered in the same way?
Yeah, gendered, and also Okinawa probably is a better place. That sort of, it put the different spin on images. And what Suge wanted is the traditional as well dark space that forgotten by the Japan's development, Japan's economic successes. But Okinawa is different. Okinawa is newly discovered, an image of sun shining on this land. I think Okinawa is almost like a mirror image of Tohoku, for example. So it may have been forgotten, but Okinawa has seen its day, and now it's ready for, I guess, ready to be exploited. I'm thinking about Tora-san films, right? A couple of times Tora-san goes to Okinawa, and that's when we see, yes, nostalgic, at the same time, very sunny nostalgia, as opposed to dark nostalgia of Tsuge Yoshiharu. So perhaps, the new images of Okinawa is, at least on the screen, is very positive and bright.
Yeah, that reminds me that while you focus on the film Kazoku, the major franchise that the director is known for is Otoko wa Tsurayo.
Yeah.
It's tough being a man.
Mm-hmm.
Does that very long film franchise support your argument in some ways, or tie into a certain idea of masculinity? I remember you mentioning, I think in the Yakuza chapter of the book, how the main character, I believe Torajiro is his name, right? Has shifted over time.
So the first 5 films, Kuruma Torajiro is basically blazoned, very unpleasant person, and really comes from outside, right? He doesn't belong to the middle class life. But now, after 5 films, he's transformed into this angelic figure, and everybody loves Torajiro. Became the national sort of figure. So even in the film, the franchise, yes, this outside figure is transformed into something nicer, somebody nicer, and somebody who can, communicate to. So the first couple of films, when I watch, whenever I watch them, I cringe because he's so unpleasant. But after 5, 6, 7, then it becomes much more pleasant to watch that series. I think we have another question.
Yes. So this question is, given your thesis that gender and sex roles in Japan have been determined by the producer-consumer relationship, which translates to male-female respectively, how do you view the elements of consent and compulsion in the internationally acclaimed work of Japanese artist Gengoro Tagame?
I'm sorry, I don't know Gengoro Tagame's work, so perhaps you can sort of inform me. If you don't have time now, perhaps you can send me email, and I'm happy to learn and think about this relationship.
Okay, that is all of our questions. So we are just 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Perhaps I'll turn it over to Professor Christie. Oh, one more question just came in. If you could wait, Ellen, for just a few more minutes. So the question is, to build off this, Okamoto Taro, in his Okinawa Bunkaron, Wasurerarata Nihon, presents this extension of earlier Minzokugaku notions of an idyllic Okinawa that has escaped Japanese modernity. So I wonder if Okinawa is discovered or rather contained as past.
Interesting point. From this response, I would say both. Discovered, and also by being discovered, it was contained as past in sort of inconvenient place to be, right? So the reservoir of the past notions. And I think you're talking about the Yanagita's concentric structure, and the civilization start from the center as you go farther, and the older layer is left there. And so that layer was discovered, but there were, I think, efforts made to maintain that kind of layered structure between center and periphery. So my answer is yes, both, but perhaps I'm missing the question, the crux of question, but I have a feeling that the questioner is getting at something deeper here.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you very much for the mediation, Drew.
Oh, my pleasure. This was great. Dr. Christie?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the conversation. I think, Yosh, that this question of, is there an outside from which to critique the process of modernization has been such a crucial question in modern Japanese historiography. And so locating a tipping point for that question in 1972, I think is really, really useful. So that was one of the things that I really took away from this book, and appreciate. It's the kind of thing that a question that I can ask in many other places as well. So, but there's a lot of rich stuff in this book. One of the things that I've loved about all of your work is that really astute reading of varieties of media in Japan and asking us to pay very close attention to it. So again, I'm really grateful for that. So I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening or morning, wherever you are, for joining us in this conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of what we hope will be a series of events in the 50th anniversary year of reversion, where we're going to be thinking with friends and others from Okinawa, from other places, about that experience of reversion. So we're putting together some events now that may go into some questions about the process of the treaty itself, but we also very much want to dive into that experience of reversion in the year 1972 and think about the legacies of reversion, what it means today, 50 years from the event itself. My first trip to Okinawa was in 1992 on the 20th anniversary of reversion, and so this is in many ways a kind of anniversary that keeps speaking to me over the years. So again, I'm grateful to everybody for coming out tonight. If you're interested in being on a mailing list to hear about more of these events, please send an email to a very simple address, OMI, O-M-I, at ucsc.edu. UCSC stands for University of California, Santa Cruz. So OMI at ucsc.edu, and we will be sure to put you on a mailing list. And I want to end by saying that OMI is a nonprofit organization that gives undergraduate, graduate students, and colleagues and friends from many institutions on both sides of the Pacific opportunities to do public humanities, public history work on Okinawa, and particularly the dramatic changes that Okinawa has experienced since 1945. And so we look forward to building more partnerships with people throughout the Okinawan Shimanchu diaspora, and with anybody who has spent time in Okinawa, particularly those who have been stationed in Okinawa as part of the American military service as well. In order to do this work, we raise money every year so that students can be employed in paid internships, graduate students can be supported in their work so that they can focus on Okinawa, and so that we can travel as a research group to Okinawa for a summer. We have gone in the past for 1 month at a time in the summer to do all kinds of work with our friends and partners in Okinawa, and have students here learn in more depth about how the study of Okinawa can proceed in the future in a collaborative fashion with the people of Okinawa itself. If you are interested in supporting us, we have a link that we can put in the chat for anybody who would like to donate. We're happy to take any amount of support that you can give us, and we're very grateful for all of you coming out today, and we hope to see you in our future events. And so with that, I see we'll give everybody a generous 2 minutes back in their day. And thank you all again for coming in. Thank you, Professor Igarashi, and thank you, Drew, for a really stimulating and informative conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.